Chapter 1. The Last War. The sky hung heavy with smoke and blood, not the sweet distant smoke of a hearth fire, but the thick choking black of burning flesh and oil. It rolled over the shattered treetops of the Drakewald like a mourning shroud. Beneath it the earth drank greedily of spilled life, so much of it that the mud no longer remembered its color. Roderik Vahl stood among the corpses, his sword dragging through the mire behind him, its edge chipped and blackened. His rake-scarred armor, once resplendent with imperial heraldry, was dented and scorched, his breastplate split open like a cracked rib cage. The red plume of his helm had long since burned away. They had been ambushed 3 days ago, what remained of them. Beastmen had poured from the tree line at dusk like locusts. Not mere war herds, but something coordinated, something wrong. Their leader had walked in silence, covered in robes of stitched human skin, speaking only to the winds until the wind itself answered. The war horn that followed shattered men's sanity before it shattered their bodies. Roderik remembered that sound. It still rang in his ears. He had fought like a cornered dog, snarling, swinging until his arms failed. His sergeant died with a tusk through his gut, screaming for Sigmar. Another knight was pulled apart limb by limb while still alive. Roderik had stabbed a Bray shaman through the throat, only to be showered in boiling blood that seared through his visor. And then silence. He didn't remember how the battle ended, only that it had. Dawn broke on the 4th day, like a blade drawn slowly across the sky, revealing a field of ruin. The survivors had either fled or lay still beneath crows. Roderik was alone. The wind shifted, carrying a foul stench, rot and magic, thick with the coppery tang of blood. Crows squabbled over a pile of entrails that had once been a man. The only sound was their pecking and the sickening squish. Roderik staggered forward, the weight of his armor pulling at his bones. Each step brought a symphony of pain from his cracked ribs and torn leg muscles. His eyes, bloodshot and hollow, scanned the carnage without expression, until he saw it. Etched crudely into the ash where the grass had been burned away was a black symbol, jagged, uneven, as though carved in fury with a war blade. It bore resemblance to nothing he had seen, not the twin-tailed comet, not the marks of the dark gods. It was a circle, incomplete, devouring itself. The ash around it seemed untouched by wind, stubborn, as though the earth itself held its breath. Roderik approached and knelt, the metal of his knees groaning. The symbol pulsed faintly, though there was no source of light. A sick feeling slithered into his gut, the kind soldiers only felt when something was deeply, unnaturally wrong. He reached out just to touch it, and a voice whispered, "To destroy the destroyers." He recoiled, staggering back. No one was there. Only the dead, and the crows, and the wind. The voice didn't come again. His breath came ragged, and in that moment something inside Roderik cracked. Not like a bone, but like a tether. His gaze fell to the rake-scarred icon on his shoulder, cracked in half from a beastman's cleaver. Slowly, without ceremony, he ripped it from the armor and let it fall into the mud. Then the chestplate. Then the gauntlets. Piece by piece he cast aside the armor he had once sworn to wear unto death. He tore off the tabard, smeared with blood and the Empire's eagle. Naked to the waist, he stood in the cold morning, steaming like an animal, watching the carrion feast. He wasn't a knight anymore. He wasn't anything. He limped away from the battlefield, leaving behind the blackened symbol and a world that had no more place for him. Chapter 2. The Hollow March. Uberstrike was rotting from the inside. Though its stone walls still bore the scars of old sieges, and its streets pulsed with trade, there was a mildew beneath the surface, something unspoken. Beggars now outnumbered merchants in the market square. The temple of Sigmar stood half-burned, shrouded in scaffolding no mason seemed to touch. The people drank too deeply, laughed too loud. and cast nervous glances at the sky when it turned red at sunset. It suited Roderik just fine. He had shed his name and colors weeks ago, entering the city as a ghost in threadbare cloaks and mismatched armor. The gold he'd taken from the battlefield bought him a room above a piss-soaked tavern called the Crooked Crown, where the walls bled mildew and the rats were too bold to fear boots. That first night the dream returned. He stood in an endless field of fire, yet it gave no heat. All around him pyres roared with colorless flame, burning knights, screaming witches, daemon princes, all devoured without smoke. And in the center, a great torch made of black bone, crowned with a crown of writhing iron. The flames began to twist inward, consuming each other until only shadow remained. Then the voice. To unmake is not to betray. It came from nowhere, everywhere, faceless, sexless, absolute. He awoke screaming, drenched in sweat. His hand clutched the knife he slept with, its edge already nicking his throat from his own reflex. His eyes scanned the shadows, but there was only the room, only the stink. No peace. The next morning Roderik found work the only way men like him ever did, by selling violence to those who paid for it. A gang called the Iron Wretches, little more than armed scum, had a bounty to collect. Bandits in the foothills north of the river, easy kill, fast coin. He didn't ask who the bandits were robbing. They rode out the next dawn, 10 men in rust-eaten armor, stinking of old beer and bad decisions. Their leader, a bald brute named Cardick, eyed Roderik with thinly veiled contempt. "You ever done this before, night boy?" he sneered. Roderik stared back without answering. His silence was answer enough. They found the bandits at dusk. A dozen desperate souls camped in an old watchtower, surrounded by tattered tents. They were ragged, starving, no warriors, just people. "Slit their throats in their sleep," Cardick whispered. "Make it clean." Roderik didn't move. Cardick spat and motioned for the others to circle wide. One of the younger mercs, a red-haired boy too green to know better, crept in and slashed a sleeping woman's throat. The sound it made was like a wet whisper. That was the moment the screaming began. 2 bandits rushed out, one with an axe and no armor. He was shot through the mouth with a crossbow bolt. Another fled into the trees. Roderik watched one of the Iron Wretches chase him, laughing. But then something cracked. A boy, no older than 15, came at Roderik with a dagger, shaking with fear. Roderik knocked it aside and drove his sword straight into the boy's belly, twisting on instinct. The child collapsed, choking on blood, eyes wide with betrayal. And there it was again, that voice, in the back of his skull. "You strike, yet feel nothing, hollow man, hollow blade." Roderik stood over the corpse, the boy's inside steaming in the night air. His hands trembled, not with guilt, but with emptiness. The wretches finished the job quickly. They torched the camp. Cardick laughed as a limping woman burned alive in her tent, her screams muffled by the flap he'd tied shut. The mercs shared meat and coin. One offered Roderik a drink. He didn't take it. Later, alone near the ashes, Roderik stared at the blackened remains of the watchtower. The fire there had burned hot, too clean. Nothing but a spiral of scorched earth remained, curling inward like the shape he'd seen in ash before. He blinked. It was gone. Back in Uberstrike, he lay in his cot, unable to sleep. The rats had grown bolder. One sat on his chest and stared at him with tiny black eyes. He didn't swat it away. "To unmake is not to betray," the voice whispered again, softer this time, like a lullaby. He closed his eyes, and in the distance, across the veil of sleep, the black flame twisted, ever-consuming. Chapter 3. The Whisper. The job was a disaster from the start. Roderik had been hired by a paranoid merchant whose daughter had disappeared in the night, taken, he claimed, by a cult operating beneath the city's sewage channels. "Easy coin," the man said. A sewer scuffle. Roderik had heard that before. What it was a trap. The cult wasn't in hiding. They were waiting. The 3 mercenaries accompanying Roderik died before they could scream. The first had his neck opened with a curved blade that hissed as it cut, liquefying flesh like boiling oil. The second was impaled through the spine by a hooked spear, dragged into a crevice of darkness that swallowed his cries. The third tried to run, but something, not beast, not man, poured out of the darkness, clutching him with dozens of gloved hands and pulling him apart like wet parchment. Roderik fought through blind instinct. His sword met flesh, muscle, bone, but each kill felt like it cost more than it earned. These cultists didn't bleed red. Some bled smoke. Some bled maggots. One wept black oil from every pore as he died. By the time Roderik clawed his way back into the rain-slick alleys of Uberstrike, he was the only one breathing. Blood smeared his face. His cloak was in tatters. He leaned against a crumbling stone wall, coughing dark phlegm, his body screaming in protest. His thoughts buzzed, unfocused, until he heard something move behind him. No sound, just presence. He spun, blade ready, though his arm barely obeyed, and there she stood. Stillness incarnate. She wore a cloak of many grays, shifting like smoke. Her face was hidden behind a mask of bone-white porcelain, smooth and featureless, save for a single black vertical line down the center. She stood barefoot in the wet muck, unbothered, as though rain didn't dare touch her. "Who are you?" Roderik rasped. Half a threat, half a plea. She tilted her head. "I am what remains when the lies burn away." Her voice was wrong. Not distorted, not inhuman, but layered like 2 people speaking at once, a woman and something deeper, older. Her presence pulled at the air like gravity. "You were watching," he accused. "You let them die." "They were already dead," she said. "They just hadn't finished falling." Roderik pressed his back against the wall. "Cultist?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped closer, her feet silent in the wet filth. "You see it, don't you?" she whispered. "The shape behind the shapes. The rot beneath the shrine." Roderik gritted his teeth. "I don't have time for riddles." "But you have time for killing in the name of coin? Time to serve lords who would bleed you for borders? Gods who never answer?" He didn't respond. She stopped inches from his face. The mask offered no expression, but he felt something beneath it, a stare that peeled layers from his soul. "There is a war beyond the war," she said. "Not for thrones, not for glory. A war to burn the lie and balance what was broken." Roderik frowned, dizzy from blood loss. "What war?" She reached into her cloak and pulled free a strip of cloth, a tattered banner, bleached white but embroidered with a half-burned circle, fraying where the stitchwork ended. "You've seen it," she said softly. "The mark of those who refuse both chaos and crown. The veiled flame." Roderik's grip tightened on his sword. "You worship something?" "We oppose something." She turned from him, stepping into the alley's gloom. "There is a place I can show you," she said, "where truth is not screamed but whispered. Come, if you want to understand the fire that devours fire." Then she was gone. Not vanished, simply unnoticed. Forgotten between blinks. Roderik sank to one knee, not from reverence but exhaustion. The rain grew heavier, and somewhere within him the voice returned. "Follow. She does not speak for gods. She speaks for undoing." He didn't know why, but he stood again, and he followed. Chapter 4. Veil and Blade. The journey to the Veiled Flames Sanctuary began at nightfall. and ended beneath the world. Roderik followed the whisper through alleys that didn't exist on any map, into storm drains that smelled not of sewage but of charred incense and rusted iron. They descended stairways carved from stone older than the Empire itself, every step echoing like a drumbeat in a tomb. After an hour he realized they were no longer beneath Uberstrike. No torches lit the path. Instead, a phosphorescent moss clung to the walls, glowing with a color that had no name. It pulsed faintly, in rhythm with Roderik's heartbeat. He touched it once and pulled away with a gasp. It was warm, too warm, like breath. They arrived at a vaulted chamber deep in the dark. The walls were covered in strange banners, white cloth scorched at the edges, marked with fractured circles and broken runes. At the center of the chamber stood a stone dais surrounded by hooded figures, each wearing a mask of stone or bone. Some bore scars that twisted beyond human anatomy. Others had limbs that jerked slightly, like puppets dancing to invisible strings. This was the veiled flame. Roderik said nothing. Neither did they. The silence was thick, not reverent, but clinical, as if words were too crude for what they were about to do. The whisper approached the dais and removed a leather-wrapped bundle from her cloak. Inside it, a blade of black iron, jagged and asymmetrical, almost alive with tension. It glistened in the low light as if wet, though no moisture stained it. She held it aloft. "A sword for a knight no longer bound," she said. "Steel forged for the war behind wars." Roderik stepped forward and she pressed the blade into his hand. It was heavy, more than it should be, and warm, like it had been waiting for him. "You carry death," the whisper said, "not of body, of structure, of lie." From behind the dais, a pale-robed figure emerged, the scribe, face hidden behind a mirrored mask that reflected nothing. He held a book bound in cracked skin, its pages soaked in old blood. "The winds of magic lie," the scribe intoned. "They are chains with color. We seek the truth beneath color, the flame beneath." He raised a hand. "Begin." The initiation was brutal. Roderik was stripped naked and tied to a brass frame bent like a sigil. Hot irons were passed over his skin, not touching, but close enough to raise steam from sweat. Whispered chants echoed through the chamber in a dozen dead tongues. None were human. Then the fire was lit. A brazier of jet-black coal erupted in flame. Only it did not rise. It pulled downward, a fire that reversed, flickering back into its fuel source like it regretted being born. The light it cast warped everything around it, casting shadows that didn't belong to anyone in the room. Roderik's breath caught in his throat. The blade in his hand trembled, and for a moment the symbols on the banners inverted, as if refusing to be seen by the fire's truth. Someone murmured, too loud for a whisper but too soft to be a shout. A glitch in the winds. It was the scribe. The whisper did not acknowledge it. Roderik was handed a dagger, its hilt made of human tooth, its edge whisper-thin and told to bleed. Not his flesh, his name. "Speak your name," the whisper said, and cut away what bound it. Roderik raised the blade, breathing hard. His voice cracked. "Roderik Vahl." He pressed the dagger into his chest, just above the heart, and cut a shallow crescent, blood beating up and falling in rhythm with his trembling. He stared at it. "I am no one's." The whisper stepped forward and placed her hand on his wound. The blood vanished into her palm like smoke. "Then you are ours." Later, clothed in fresh black robes lined with hidden sigils, Roderik sat alone in a side chamber, staring at the fire pit where the reverse flame had burned. Nothing remained but cold ash. Yet he swore the ashes were spiraling inward. Not scattered, pulling into themselves. He felt the weight of the blade now resting across his lap, not just steel, but a symbol, a pact. He wasn't fighting for gods anymore. Not the Empire, not chaos. Something else. something that hated them both. Chapter 5. Buried Light. The fortress loomed like a corpse in the forest. What once was a Sigmarite bastion, its towers now sagged under rot and time, its walls consumed by crawling ivy and bird droppings, stained black where fire had kissed it during some long-forgotten siege. The twin-tailed comet still adorned the gates, but its edges had worn away, almost mocking the god it represented. Roderik stood in the doorway with the others of the Veiled Flame, staring into the crumbling maw of the past. "This was sacred ground," whispered one of the masked acolytes. "Now it's only grave dirt for broken dogma," replied the whisper, leading the way inside. The interior was worse than the outside. Mold climbed the walls. Rats, bold and fat, skittered along shelves that once held holy scripture, now turned to pulp. Old bones littered the corners, some still wrapped in gray robes marked with Sigmar's sun. Others slumped in kneeling positions, hands curled in final prayer. The deeper they went, the colder it grew. The silence pressed on Roderik like a vice, every step accompanied by the soft crunch of time-devoured faith beneath his boots. They found the entrance to the catacombs behind a false altar. A mechanism, long rusted shut, groaned as they forced it open. A breath of stale, bitter air spilled out, thick with mildew and something older, something buried. The tunnels below were not on any record. Roderik led the way now, sword drawn, the edge singing softly in his grip, a new trick it had learned since the reverse flame rite. The tunnels branched erratically, like veins through a corpse. The walls were carved with symbols both familiar and corrupted. Sigmar's comet, yes, but fractured down the middle, or surrounded by flames that curved inward instead of rising. "This sect turned on itself," said the whisper, "not out of heresy, out of disillusionment." "And were silenced," the scribe muttered, trailing fingers along a mural half swallowed by rot, "like all those who ask the wrong questions." A scream shattered the silence. They rushed into the next chamber, finding one of their scouts dead, his head caved in by an altar stone, hands still reaching for a skeletal figure clutching something tight. Not treasure, not scripture. A helm. It sat in the skeleton's lap as if offered in defiance. Split down the middle by design, one half polished to a near-divine gleam, the other a deadened iron black, lightless and cold. The front bore no sigils, no iconography, only a thin central line where the two halves met, too precise to be the result of any craftsman Roderik had known. "It rejected allegiance," murmured the whisper, staring at it with something like reverence. "A symbol forged not for worship, but for resistance." Roderik stepped forward. He didn't think, he simply knew. His hands reached out, and the moment his fingers touched the helm, the chamber shuddered. A pulse echoed through the stone, not sound, but pressure, like a heartbeat buried deep in the rock. Dust fell from the ceiling. A low, unnatural growl rumbled from tunnels unseen. And then they came. Bonfians. Malformed skeletons wrapped in fragments of rusted Sigmarite plate burst from the side corridors, eyes glowing with inverted light, darkness that glowed, like wounds in reality. Their weapons were broken relics, but they swung them with impossible speed and hatred. The first one lunged for Roderik. He met it mid-charge, blade flashing, cleaving through bone and helm. The skull cracked like pottery, spilling powdered ash instead of blood. Another drove a flanged mace into an acolyte's chest, caving it in with a single echoing blow. The man's scream gurgled as his ribs punctured his lungs. Roderik fought like a thing possessed. Every clash of steel sent shockwaves of pain up his arm, but he did not stop. When one fiend leapt from above, he drove his blade up through its jaw, splitting the skull in half. Another he knocked down and stomped, again and again, until bone turned to dust, and his boot was slick with ichor that should not have existed. The whisper hurled twin daggers into empty sockets. The scribe chanted under his breath, his voice drawing light from the air and bending it into blades of absence, slicing through rib cages with impossible precision. When the last bone fiend fell, silence returned, breathing heavy in the aftermath. Roderik, panting and spattered in strange dust, still held the helm in one hand. The other gripped his blade, now humming a low, vibrating hum of unease. He raised the helm and placed it on his head. And for a moment, he saw, not with eyes, but something deeper, flames in reverse, a throne crumbling in the void, chains made of gods, snapping. Then it was gone. The whisper watched him carefully. "You've crossed a threshold," she said. Roderik said nothing. The helm remained on his head. It fit perfectly. And far below, unseen by all, the spiral turned once more. Chapter 6. What Lies Beneath. The gray mountains loomed like a storm, frozen in stone. Their crags clawed at the sky, jagged and cruel, casting long shadows across the valley floor. Snow fell in sheets, not soft but sharp, like powdered bone. The peaks whispered in the wind, carrying half-syllables of forgotten languages that made the mind itch. Roderik rode with 3 others from the veiled flame, cloaked in black and gray. His new helm, half bright and half dark, was wrapped in cloth and strapped to his side, but its presence still hummed like a buried heartbeat. Each step of his mount echoed in his skull. Their target lay deep in the mountain's shadow, a cave system once used as a smuggler's pass, now overtaken by whispers of a chaos cult spreading like fungus through the surrounding villages. Except the whispers had stopped. No more raids, no more screams. Just silence. Too much silence. They reached the mouth of the cave by dusk, where frozen blood painted the stones like blasphemous calligraphy. No sentries, no torches, only that smell, not rot, but wrongness, like copper and sulfur, buried under a stench of old ash and candle wax. Roderik dismounted. Steel rasped as he drew his sword, its edge briefly catching the failing light. His fingers tensed. Something felt unmade. Not dead, not even desecrated, just voided, like a page scraped blank. They entered. The inside of the cave told a story no one had lived to finish. Corpses lay everywhere, cultists in blood-red robes, their bodies mangled beyond comprehension. One had his spine torn out from the front, ribs exploded outward like burst fruit. Another's head had been caved in so perfectly it looked sculpted. Most had no eyes, sockets hollow and blackened, as if burned from within. Roderik knelt beside a woman curled into a fetal position, her lips still twitching with dying breath. Her throat had been crushed inward by bare hands, knuckle prints scorched into the skin. "No imperial force did this," whispered one of the acolytes behind him. "No," Roderik agreed. "This wasn't strategy. This was judgment." Deeper in the caves they found the altar chamber. The scene defied logic. The cult's idol, a bloated figure of Nurgle wrought from meat, bone, and rusted iron, was ripped from its dais, hurled into a wall with such force that the rock behind it had fractured outward. Blood painted every surface, but it wasn't fresh, it wasn't right. It shimmered like oil, smelling of ozone and incense, a contradiction of existence. At the center kneeled a survivor, warped, mutated. One arm a tendril of pulsating pink flesh, the other a shriveled claw. His mouth twitched with what was once a sermon but now gibbered only syllables made of static. Roderik stepped toward him. His blade hummed, not eager, uneasy. The cultist's eyes locked on him, what was left of them. "You wear the mark," he hissed. "Ash-bearer." Roger froze. The creature gurgled, coughed blood. Then, with trembling claw, he scratched something into the stone floor beside him, each stroke more frenzied, more desperate. It formed a spiral, A broken circle. 9 lines. The 9th devouring the rest. Then, in a voice that was not his, the dying priest spoke with clarity not meant for mortals. He returns. The eyes flared with black fire, and his body imploded, not exploded, imploded, folded in upon itself, shrinking into nothing, until there was no corpse, no clothes, just a smear of ash, shaped like a screaming face. The acolyte beside Roderik screamed and fled. Roderik did not move. His grip on his blade tightened, knuckles white. In the silence that followed, he whispered the words aloud. "The God-Eater returns?" Later, as they burned what remained of the cult and sealed the cave with powder and spell, Roderik walked alone among the corpses. The snow had begun to fall again, softer now. He looked back once, toward the ruined altar. The smear of ash was still there, and though the wind blew fierce, the ash did not move. Chapter 7. The Black Flame. They kept the demon host in the cellar, beneath a forgotten watchtower, a cage within a circle of warding runes, bolted shut with black steel nails and salted silver. Even sealed, its presence seeped through the stones like rot in the lungs. It had been captured 2 nights prior, when a band of witch hunters stumbled across it in the ruins of a chapel gutted by fire. Most of them died trying to banish it. The one who survived simply ran, sobbing and blind. It was the whisper who brought the creature in, wrapped in binding chains, etched with forbidden prayers. Roderik hadn't seen it until now, and it knew him the moment he entered the cellar. The air grew wet with breathless heat, despite the winter outside. The rune circle flickered. The thing crouched in the corner of its cell like a marionette discarded mid-dance, limbs too long, neck bent backward, mouth stitched shut with iron wire. The skin was not flesh but tissue stretched ink, covered in glyphs that moved when you looked too long. Eyes like black pits opened across its body, blinking independently. One of them, above the navel, wept molten wax. As Roderik approached, it twitched, jerked, sniffed. Then it spoke, not with lips, but through the wires, the sound ripping through the air like meat tearing from bone. Voices, multiple, overlapping, screaming in contradiction. Ashbearer, oath forgotten, who wears the helm of split dawn. Mirror burner, unmaker, remaker. Roderik froze. The room seemed to twist around him, the walls bending ever so slightly inward. His fingers itched against the hilt of his blade. "What is it saying?" he asked, voice low. The whisper stood behind him, stiff as stone. "It knows something it shouldn't," she murmured. "It shouldn't know you." The demon host began to writhe, its spine contorting like a hooked eel, slamming its head into the wall and bleeding smoke. The runes beneath it flared, barely holding. "You smell of him," it screeched, "of the flame that devours flame. You speak the lie that burns lies. You wear the God who does not forgive." Roderik took a step forward, jaw tight. The demon host stopped moving, then slowly smiled. Its jaw snapped open, the iron wire melting with a hiss. Blood and wax dripped from its lips. "He waits behind the mirror," it whispered. "And you are its crack." Then it screamed. The cell exploded in black fire. Roderik was hurled back into the stone wall, cracking it with his weight. One acolyte was flung across the room, his neck twisting with a wet snap. The other tried to speak a word, but the words died in his throat as the flame poured into his mouth and boiled him from the inside, his eyes bursting in tandem. Roderik rolled to his feet, sword raised, but the fire had already consumed the demon host and vanished. Nothing remained but ash and a smear of shadow writhing across the stone floor, like a reflection without a source. That night, Roderik stared into the cracked mirror above the basin in his chamber. His face was tired, scarred, blood-flecked, same as ever. Until it moved. His reflection blinked half a second too late. He froze. Then it smiled. Not a smirk, not madness, just a calm, knowing smile. Roderik reached for his dagger and shattered the glass. The whisper came to him hours later, her cloak soaked with rain. "You're being noticed," she said. "Not just by the gods, not by the Empire, by something older, something that remembers." Roderik didn't look up from the shard in his hand. "I didn't ask to be noticed." "That doesn't matter anymore," she replied. "The ash-bearer doesn't choose, he is chosen." He glanced at his reflection in the bloodied steel. It didn't blink. Chapter 8. Cracks in the Sigil. Marienburg was a city built on gold, corruption, and secrets. Its towering guild halls and spire-ridden cathedrals glittered under a perpetually gray sky, masks of opulence barely hiding the decay that bloomed beneath the cobbles. Rats grew fat on merchant blood, thieves prayed louder than priests, and somewhere among the bone-white mansions and wind-lashed canals, something unspoken moved with purpose. Roderik arrived under cover of dusk, the veiled flame disguised as dockworkers and scribes. The target, House Van Issel, an ancient noble line known for its maritime power, rumored to fund private collections of occult artifacts under the guise of antiquities. They'd caught whispers of a particular object in their latest auction, a symbol never meant for mortal eyes. The infiltration was surgical. The mansion sprawled across a fortified island on the Rake's southern fork, opulent and guarded. The veiled flame's best, Roderik, the Whisper, two masked acolytes, slipped in via the sewers, climbing up through a drain in the wine cellar, where old corpses whispered in the walls. Blood wards, sigils scribed in dried noble ichor, adorned the basement. Roderik carved through one with his dagger, the iron hissing against the arcane linework like a snake set on fire. They made it to the artifact chamber just as the auction above reached its crescendo. Inside, velvet-draped pedestals, tomes bound in uncured skin, statuettes depicting impossible geometry, and a sword that dripped blood in reverse, the droplets rising back into the blade. But one item sat beneath a locked crystal dome, and it drew Roderik like a hook in the soul. He removed the covering, hand trembling. The relic sat, innocently enough, a medallion, perhaps the size of a palm, made of metal that pulsed subtly with heat. At first he thought it was the 8-pointed star, symbol of chaos. But it wasn't. It had 9 points. Not arranged in symmetry, not equal. One of the arms curved inward, a jagged crescent that seemed to consume the others, pulling them into itself. The points around it were warped, as though crushed by some unseen gravity. The metal gleamed black at the edges, white at the core, but no matter how you looked at it, it remained wrong. It was a symbol of contradiction, of annihilation, of something that wasn't meant to be part of chaos, but to devour it. Roderik stared, and his knees buckled. He vomited violently across the stone floor, retching bile, shaking with cold. The Whisper rushed to his side, grabbing his shoulders. "What did you see?" He gasped between heaves. "It moved." She looked at the medallion. "It doesn't move." "I swear to you," he coughed, eyes wild. "It moved. It ate the other points. I saw them fold into it, like they were always meant to die." He collapsed to one side, shuddering. Upstairs, voices shouted. The auction had ended. Someone had tripped a ward. The door burst open. Thugs in crimson coats and gold-threaded sashes surged in, armed with pistols and cleavers. One bore the Van Issel crest tattooed on his face, flanked by sorcerers with glowing brand sigils. The Whisper stood over Roderik and unleashed a shriek that fractured glass, rupturing the first man's eardrums and sending blood pouring from his eyes. Roderik staggered to his feet, blade in hand, half-blind with nausea, swinging wildly as gunfire thundered around him. An acolyte took a bullet to the temple. The other hurled himself forward with a blade of shimmering black light, slicing a thug clean in half from clavicle to hip, intestines steaming on the stone. Roderik fought on instinct. One man lunged. Roderik drove his sword into his gut and twisted, wrenching the blade sideways to spill him like a sack. Another tried to speak a spell. Roderik slammed his helm into the man's face, shattering bone and teeth, then slit his throat mid-scream. Blood sprayed across the relic as it pulsed again. The Whisper grabbed it with gloved hands, wrapping it in velvet. "Time to go," she hissed. They escaped through the rear courtyard, hounded by gunfire and lightning spells, diving into the icy canal below. The water swallowed them whole. Later, back at their safe house, the Whisperer laid the relic on the stone table. Roderik sat across from it, face pale, hands trembling. "You've seen that shape before," she said quietly. "In my dreams," he whispered. "Not as metal, as flame. Black flame, devouring, consuming everything, even chaos." The Whisper said nothing for a long while. "Then there are gods whose names were never meant to be spoken, whose worship was not outlawed, but erased." She looked at him with something close to fear. "And you carry its mark." Chapter 9. False Order. The so-called Brothers of the Coil welcomed them with open arms. They dressed in clean robes of emerald and gold, their sanctum carved into the bones of an abandoned mining fortress near the Greywater fastness. Their rhetoric was righteous, direct, freedom from chaos through knowledge, structure, and order. They claimed to fight the same war as the Veiled Flame, against corruption, against the rot at the heart of creation. And for a time, Roderik believed them. Their texts, ancient and dense, spoke of the order beyond chaos and truths written before time. They quoted principles that mirrored the Veiled Flame's own. Balance through destruction, lies must burn for clarity to rise. Their leader, Seraphim the Vellum-eyed, spoke like a prophet dipped in ash, softly, elegantly, and always with a kind of condescending serenity that made Roderik's teeth itch. Still, the Whisper said nothing. She observed, measured, waited. That alone set Roderik on edge. After 3 days, the truth bled through. It came with the scent of ozone and the feeling of one's skin crawling without contact. Roderik was reading an old manuscript, parchment stitched from unknown skin, text inked in threads of hair, when he realized the writing kept changing when he looked away. Glyphs inverted, lines twisted, words became images, then sounds, then scream. He slammed the book shut, bile rising in his throat. That night he caught a brother etching a new sigil into the wall of the prayer chamber, a 9-pointed star that bled ink. The outer points bent like talons, the center a void ringed with whispering eyes. "Not Melo. Zinch." He confronted Seraphim in the sanctum's deepest chamber, a cathedral carved into obsidian, its dome lined with mirrors that reflected nothing but teeth. "You lie," Roderik growled, sword drawn, helm down. Seraphim stood at the pulpit, calm and smiling. "I illuminate. You refuse the shape of the truth. You serve Zinch." "I serve change," the cultist corrected. "The God who breaks the rules so new ones may grow. The fire that gives meaning to the ash. You murder order to replace it with delusion." Seraphim laughed, a soft, pitying sound that turned Roderik's stomach. "You think the Veiled Flame resists chaos. But chaos birthed you too, Ash-bearer. Even your silence is its echo." Roderik moved like thunder. He crossed the black stone floor in 3 strides and drove his sword into Seraphim's chest, but the body rippled, stuttered, as though reality itself hiccuped. The blade split through cloth and bone, but the wound shed no blood, only parchment. shredded pages. Seraphine stared into Roderik's eyes, smile unbroken. "You never asked what flame you carry." Then he screamed. Not in agony, in scripture. 1,000 voices erupted from his throat, everyone reciting a different version of the same truth, none comprehensible. Words blistered the air, the walls cracked, the mirrors shattered. Seraphine's body convulsed, and then crumpled, not like flesh, like paper being burned from the inside, curling into ash, shaped like screaming letters. The entire room filled with an impossible chorus of ink screaming. Roderik staggered back, clutching his ears. Blood poured from his nose. One of the brothers tried to flee, but the letters leapt from the ash, wrapped around his throat and dragged him into the floor, fusing his flesh into the stone with wet, snapping cracks. The rest of the veiled flame arrived moments later, weapons drawn. Too late. The whisper entered last. She stood among the flickering torches and screaming residue of vanished things, and simply... "This was expected," she said. Roderik turned to her, eyes bloodshot. "You knew?" She nodded once. "Siege sends many spies. Most forget they are spies." Later, outside among the rain-slick rocks, Roderik sat alone, staring into the flame of his lantern. He held a scrap of ash-covered parchment recovered from Seraphine's body. It still screamed. He dropped it into the fire and it shrank away from the flame, as if afraid. And deep inside himself, Roderik felt the thing he carried recoil. Not in pain, in recognition. Chapter 10. The Whisper Taken. They had barely crossed into the Reichwald when the trap closed around them. The forest, once silent in its winter slumber, screamed as the ambush was sprung. Bolts tore through the trees like lightning. One struck an acolyte through the throat, spurting arterial mist across Roderik's helm as the man collapsed, gurgling. Roderik drew his blade before he breathed. The veiled flame had set camp in an old watchtower ruin, its stone slick with moss, forgotten by road and map. Now it became their tomb. Witch hunters. Not mercenaries, not cultists. Sigmar's black-hatted executioners, cloaked in righteousness and paranoia, descended from the woods in a coordinated pincer. Their purity seals fluttered like flayed skin, muskets braced, sabers drawn. "Heretic scum," a voice bellowed. "By fire and faith you are judged." The whisper stood calmly at the heart of the chaos, hands lifted in peace. And they didn't care. A shot cracked. She flinched, then fell, netted by a bolt lined with silver thorns. "No!" Roderik roared, surging forward. A bullet caught him in the side, ripping flesh and breaking ribs. He crashed to the ground, choking on blood. His sword skittered out of reach. Pain racked him, like molten nails through his veins, but worse than pain was helplessness. He saw them drag her away, bound and bleeding, her porcelain mask cracked at the temple. The last thing he heard before blacking out was her voice, calm, resolute. "The fire burns without me. Do not let it die." Darkness. Then, screaming. Not from mouths. From the sky. Roderik opened his eyes to a place without shape. The dreamscape was not a dream. It was a wound in existence. A realm where reason buckled and bled. Colors clashed violently against each other, twisting into shapes that could not be named. The air reeked of wet parchment and burning flesh, and the ground, if it could be called that, was made of calcified chaos, shifting bones frozen in loops of agony. In the distance, chaos devoured itself. He saw the gods, not as thrones or idols, but as formless tempests, corn-all blades and blind wrath, tearing through rivers of blood that looped endlessly into its own mouth. Nurgle, a bloated infestation of rot that birthed and ate itself in a cycle of infection. Tzeentch was a kaleidoscope of screaming masks, shifting faster than thought, spelling equations in flesh before melting into screams. Slanesh shimmered in pleasure and pain, a thing of mirrors and hunger, devouring reflections. And above them, a void, a black crown without jewels, a flame burning inward, something not worshipped, something loathed. They clawed at it, the gods. They fought it, all of them, desperate, hateful, because it did not want control. It wanted negation, the anti-god, the ungod, the flaw in their perfection. It didn't rage, it didn't speak. It waited, and fed on their failure. Roderik stood on nothing, watched everything, and felt it watching him. The black flame twisted into a reflection of his helm, half light, half void, then shattered into ash. He screamed, and woke. Roderik jolted upright with a guttural cry, limbs flailing, soaked in blood and sweat. The wound in his side pulsed like a second heartbeat. Pain crashed into him like a warhammer. He was back in the ruins, alone. The fire was dead. The whisper was gone. Only ash remained where she'd stood. And the trees whispered, "She is taken. You are marked. The fire burns through you now." Roderik stared into the void of the dying coals, breath shaking. He wasn't ready, but it no longer mattered. Chapter 11. Echoes of the Mask. The prison lay beneath a ruined cathedral outside Altdorf, a place once consecrated to Sigmar, now used to purge those deemed heretical, unclean, or inconvenient. The stained glass had long shattered. The altar was a cracked slab, its surface burned clean of iconography. The air stank of burnt hair, iron, and despair. Roderik moved through it like a ghost of vengeance, the veiled flame reduced to 2 acolytes flanking him in the dark. He had tracked the Whisper for 3 days, her captors always a step ahead, but now she was here. He felt it, not in his heart, but in his blade, which pulsed with heat every time he drew near. The catacombs were a labyrinth of chains and screams. Torture cells lined the walls, some still occupied by broken things that once were men. Others held only ash. Sigmarite zealots called this place a hall of cleansing. It felt like a tomb of lies. They found her cell at the lowest level. The door was iron, blackened, and sealed with prayer runes scrawled in dried blood, vibrating faintly with energy. Roderik pressed his ear to the metal and heard nothing. That silence terrified him more than any scream. He raised his blade, and the door hissed, the runes shriveling as the sword neared. The veiled flame's black fire ate their meaning, reducing holy words to cinders. He kicked the door open. The Whisper hung from chains, arms stretched above her head, skin torn in lash patterns. Her mask had been shattered, fragments embedded in her face, crimson seeping from beneath them. Her mouth bled. One eye was swollen shut. But she was alive. Barely. She raised her head as he entered, her voice a croak. "I knew you'd come. The fire isn't yours yet." Roderik moved to free her when the air changed. A heavy step echoed behind him. He turned and saw the zealot. He was massive, clad in ruined Sigmarite plate, etched with flaking gold and madness. His eyes burned with unslept fanaticism, and around his neck hung a relic, a piece of stone chiseled with runes too worn to read, dangling like a shackle. "The Ash-bearer," the man growled. "I smelled your heresy the moment you stepped into the catacombs." Roderik raised his sword. "Let her go." The zealot laughed, thick and ragged. "She whispers of the 9th flame, the god whose name was struck from the stones, the traitor's god, the unmaker. You wear his stink like armor." Roderik lunged. The duel was savage. The zealot swung a warhammer wreathed in holy fire, not magic but pure conviction. Roderik dodged, the blow pulverizing stone where he'd just stood. Sparks exploded, debris rained. Roderik slashed, his blade slicing across the zealot's pauldron. Black fire hissed as it met gold, but the man didn't slow. They crashed together like titans. The zealot headbutted Roderik, breaking his nose, then slammed his elbow into Roderik's wounded side. Roderik howled, falling to one knee. "You follow nothing," the zealot spat. "A god that exists only to undo." Roderik coughed blood and rose again. "I follow no god," he snarled, "but I'll end yours." With a roar, he ducked a wild swing, rolled behind, and drove his blade between the plates of the zealot's back armor. The blade sank in deep. The zealot stiffened, then began to convulse, mouth opening in a silent scream. From the wound, black flame erupted, consuming not his body, but his belief. The purity seals on his armor blackened and peeled. The relic around his neck cracked and wept sand. The runes on his warhammer shrieked, actual sound, and shattered into glyph dust. Then the zealot fell, not with a thud, but with a whimper. Roderik turned back to the whisper, shoving the key into her chains, catching her before she collapsed. "I'm here," he whispered, pressing her broken mask pieces into her palm. "You're not done." Her lips twitched. "We have to move. They'll come." She shook her head. "No. They're already burning." "What?" "Your blade, your presence. You are fire they cannot extinguish. Their order is already breaking." She looked at the corpse of the zealot, now nothing more than cracked armor and the scent of regret, and she whispered. He remembered the name, the one they struck from the stones. Roderik felt something turn in his chest. A wheel, a lock, a door almost open. Chapter 12. Night of Nothing. The battlefield was not a field. It was a temple long since devoured, a ruin in the barren reach where the sky wept ash instead of rain. Once a shrine to Sigmar, its towering spires now lay broken like snapped limbs, its altar defiled by silk banners and grotesque sculptures of flesh frozen mid-ecstasy. The wind carried the distant sound of choirs, but not human. Not anymore. This was Uberstrike's domain now. He had once ridden beside Roderik, a Templar of the Reiksguard, a knight of flame and thunder. Now he stood among the ruins, wreathed in perfume, rot and sin, clad in armor of violet steel and living veins. His face, once noble, was now stretched and too smooth, an eerie mask of perfection, its smile surgically eternal. Plumes of silk trailed from his shoulders like banners of vanity. "Roderik Vahl," he called, voice smooth as blood wine. "I barely recognized you without your leash." Roderik stepped into the light. No heraldry, no gilded plate, just steel and ash. The half-dark helm at his side, the veiled flame etched across his chest in soot and black wax. "You were always weak," Uberstrike said, stepping forward with a flourish. "Afraid to feel, afraid to want. Now look at you, scabbed over with doubt, clinging to smoke." "I see clearly now," Roderik replied. "You worship a god of lies told with silk." "I am the lie," Uberstrike smiled, "and they love me for it." The duel began without fanfare. Uberstrike moved like a whisper, sword flashing in curves too elegant for mortal understanding. The first strike shattered a pillar behind Roderik. The second came inches from his throat, only deflected by instinct and raw hate. Roderik countered, steel meeting steel, and the clang of their blades echoed like thunder across the ruins. Uberstrike danced with inhuman grace, laughing between strikes. "Your flame is false. It burns you more than me." Roderik said nothing, until his blade struck home, scraping across Uberstrike's breastplate, and sang. The sound wasn't metal. It was chanting. The sword lit up. White fire erupted from its length, pure, searing, blinding. but within it danced a second flame, thin, sharp, and pitch-black, like a crack in reality burning through the light itself. Uberstrike recoiled, stumbling backward, his masked smile flickering. No. Roderik advanced. The flame clung to him, not consuming, but expressing. Not wrath, but denial. Uberstrike screamed, retreating, his voice cracking. "That is not holy fire. That is not chaos." Roderik swung, once, twice, his strikes carving gouges of nothing into the ground. When they struck stone, the flame didn't burn, it unmade. Uberstrike's blade shattered on the third clash. He fell to the ground, hands raised. "That sigil on your chest, it's not a god's gift, it's a curse." Roderik stopped and said, cold and low, "It's a mirror." Uberstrike screamed and scrambled away, silk streaming, face finally cracking with real fear. "You serve it. The enemy of all. The traitor to gods and men." He turned and fled into the darkness, shrieking, "You serve the enemy of all." Roderik did not give chase. He stood alone in the silent ruin, the white-black flame dying down along his blade, whispering into smoke. The ground hissed where the fire had touched. The whisper emerged from the shadows, still limping from her wounds, but watching with wide eyes. "He saw something," she said. Roderik nodded. "They all do. Before the end." She looked at him, not as a leader, but now as something else. "You're no knight." "No," he said, sliding the blade into its sheath. "And what knights kneel to when they fall." Chapter 13. The Lost War. They rode in silence through the mist-choked woodlands of Dragwald, where trees leaned as though whispering secrets to one another. Nothing lived here, not truly. Birds did not sing, insects did not crawl. The wind moved but did not breathe. It was a place that had once been sacred, now it was dying. The trees were bone-pale, bark peeling in strips like flesh, the earth beneath the horses' hooves squelched with an unnatural wetness, though there'd been no rain for days. And ahead, the forest burned, not with fire, but with something worse. Stones. Dozens of them, rising like jagged teeth from the soil, arranged in a broken spiral. Once, these stones would have hummed with ley energy, connecting to the winds of magic. Now, they bled. Each rune etched into their surface was reversed, their elegant calligraphy turned into gutter snarls, spiraling inward instead of flowing out. Black ichor oozed from the runes, thick as oil, sticky as tar, sizzling as it touched the grass. The stench was unbearable. Burned silk, rotted wine, and wet ashes. Roderik dismounted in silence. The whisper walked ahead, her steps slow, reverent but wary. "This was once a gate," she murmured, "a focus point, a place where stars whispered to mortals. Now it's a scar." "What happened here?" Roderik asked. She looked to the sky, and for the first time since he'd known her, she hesitated. "There was a war," she said finally, "long before this empire, long before Aelves and dwarfs and the tearing of the veil, before gods took names and daemons wore banners." She turned to him, eyes haunted. A war within chaos itself. Roderik's breath caught. "What?" She nodded. Before there were 5. The Aelf stones groaned. One of them cracked violently, spewing a gout of steaming black blood that hissed into the air, forming glyphs that burned as they vanished. "They don't speak of him," she said, "because he doesn't want. He doesn't hunger. He doesn't promise." She knelt before one of the stones and ran her fingers over the inverted rune. It shriveled under her touch. And that was his domain. Not lies, not lust, not blood, not decay, but the destruction of all destruction, the burning of rot, the silencing of screams, the betrayal of betrayal. Roderik stared at the stones, hands clenched. He erased. Because he saw what chaos was, she said, rising. A machine with no brake, a spiral with no center. He refused. He fought. Her voice dropped. And the other four devoured him. The ground shook beneath their feet. A pulse, like a heart long buried. Roderik turned slowly, eyes scanning the shadows. From the mist, something moved. Not beast, not daemon. Something between. Its form was wrong. An exiled thought made flesh. Twisting antlers of bone, skin of shimmering mirrored ruin. Mouth stitched shut. Hands weeping golden pus. It stepped through the trees and breathed disease and song, its body splitting in 3 directions at once. A shard of the lost war. Back, the whisper said, already drawing sigils in the air. Roderik stepped forward. No. He drew his sword. The white flame hissed into life, its edge black as guilt. The thing howled, not in rage, but in recognition. It remembered. Roderik met it head-on, blade flashing. It lunged with too many limbs. He severed them, hacked them down, the fire carving not through flesh, but through intent. Each cut unwove the thing's shape, unraveling it with screams that spoke in centuries. It collapsed, twitching, and its final death cry was not a roar. It was a prayer in reverse. After, Roderik stood among the ichor, trembling. He looked at the whisperer. You said there were 5. She nodded. And now? She looked up toward the sky hidden behind the ash clouds. He turns. And the ichor pooled in the cracked stone behind them, forming a spiral with 9 points. One eating the rest. Chapter 14. The Blade Remade. Karakrin was dead. What remained of the ancient dwarf stronghold clung to the mountain like a drunkard to a broken bottle, half buried, half sunken, and wholly forsaken. Centuries ago, a warp rift had torn through the stone beneath its deepest forge, leaving behind a scar so deep even the ancestors refused to remember it. And yet, one runesmith remained. His name was Durkrun Blackteen, though he no longer answered to it. Beard matted with soot, and his left eye replaced with a copper scope that whirred when he blinked. He spoke in mutters and curses, with ash under his nails and hate in his breath. He had once forged rune blades for High Thanes. Now he drank molten ale and hammered at nothing. They found him in the old forge chamber, lit by slag fires that burned with no fuel, the walls etched with runes long since cracked and bleeding rust. The air reeked of metallic sorrow and sulfur. Roderik offered the sword without a word. The old blade, once his rakescarred saber, reforged in fire, now warped by black flame and purpose. It was chipped, pitted, humming with a pulse too slow to be alive, too insistent to be dead. Durkrun spat on it. Burns my bones to look at it, he rasped. Can you reforge it? Roderik asked. The dwarf squinted at him through the lens. You ain't a knight, you ain't a daemon. You're what crawls between. Why should I? Roderik's reply was flat. Because it knows what's coming. The forge fire was stoked with ash from dead runes, mixed with charcoal soaked in demon blood. Durkrun worked without gloves, his fingers blistered from hammer and spell, muttering chants from forgotten dialects, some of which the whisper refused to translate. The ore he used was veinstone, a mineral found near a warp rift that had since collapsed into a hole that unreflected light. The chunk was a dull gray, but when struck, it sang like bone being cracked underwater. For days, Roderik waited, dreaming of blades with mouths, and of gods bleeding ink instead of ichor. On the 3rd night, the screams began. From the forge, not Durkrun. Not Roderik. The metal screamed. It resisted. It remembered. When it was done, The blade did not shine. It did not glow. It hummed. Soft, uneasy, like a dog sensing poison. The edge was so fine it blurred at the tip, the metal striated with veins of white and black, twisting like opposing flames locked in silent war. The hilt was wrapped in iron cloth, soaked in holy water that steamed the moment it touched the steel. Dirkrun stared at the weapon for a long time before handing it to Roderik. "It'll never love you," he said, "but it'll kill the things that fear love." Roderik took it, and the forge went quiet. They tested it 3 days later. A demon of corn, trapped in a binding circle of blood and salt, was dragged from the vault below. The thing snarled, blades for arms, eyes molten with fury, screaming for murder. Roderik stepped forward. The moment he raised the sword, it screamed louder, not in rage, in fear. The blade did not glow with power. It trembled, not in hunger, in disgust. Roderik slashed. The demon fell in two. Its body didn't bleed, it didn't writhe, it withered, like paper set too close to a heatless flame. It collapsed into a pile of ash that twitched and whispered, then vanished with a breath. The circle remained, but it no longer pulsed. The whisper watched from a distance, feeling. "He didn't forge a weapon," she said. "No," Roderik murmured, holding the blade close. "He unearthed one." Chapter 15. The Whisper's True Name. The storm broke over the Dagger Hills like the gods were weeping oil and ash. Lightning carved the horizon into jagged black teeth, and rain hit the broken tower in which Roderik and the Whisper sheltered like shards of shattered glass. She sat in silence, half her porcelain mask shattered from battle. Blood seeped from the cracks and dried along her jaw. Her cloak steamed in the firelight, and her breath rattled in her chest like a furnace nearing collapse. Roderik tended the fire with one hand, the other resting on the hilt of his new blade. It hadn't stopped humming since they left Karak Rim. Neither of them spoke for a long time, until she whispered, not in her double voice, but in her own, "Do you want to know my name?" Roderik looked up, surprised. "I thought you left it behind." "I did," she replied, "but you carry a blade now that remembers things meant to be forgotten, so perhaps it's time." She pulled what remained of her mask from her face and set it gently beside the fire. Beneath it, her features were human. Broken, scarred, but human. Her left eye was milky, clouded from old injury. Her lips were split, one side trembling slightly when she spoke. "My name was Mela Grent. I was a battle sister of the Order Penitent. I once wore white and gold. I once believed." Roderik stared. "What happened?" She smiled, thin and sad. "I found a door. It was 5 years ago. Her order had been sent to cleanse a shrine in the Weeping Vale, a holy site, or so the pilgrims claimed, but it had fallen silent. Not to corruption, not to war, just silence. Even the wind had stopped. They found bones in perfect prayer positions. Every corpse, untouched by violence, but wrong, muscles still tensed, eyes open, mouths half smiling, as if caught mid-liturgy. In the crypt below she found the vault. It was sealed in gold, warded by runes that had been scratched from the stone by something inside. They should have left, but she opened it. The scriptures inside were alive. Not breathing, but watching. The ink squirmed across the pages like it wanted to remember you. The words rearranged themselves when she blinked. She tried to burn them. The fire turned black and consumed nothing. She read. Each line struck like a hammer to the soul. They spoke of a god betrayed by gods, a flame forgotten by flame, a name that unnames, and something else. "A war," she said softly. "Not fought on battlefields, but in the bones of belief, in the marrow of the soul. A war that rewrote reality so perfectly, the loser was unmade from memory. She was found days later, still alive, eyes bloodshot, chanting in a voice that wasn't hers. Her order branded her a heretic. They tried to purge her. She killed 5 of them with her bare hands. "I didn't stop believing," she said, voice hoarse. "I just stopped believing in them. The 4, the cults, even Sigmar." She turned her gaze on him, haunted and full of fire. "They're all echoes, Roderik. Beautiful lies in competition, but that God I found, he's not a lie. He's the space between them, the rot in their song, the one who waits for their end." "And you serve him?" Roderik asked. She shook her head. "No, no one serves him. You don't follow a black hole." She leaned forward, face close to the fire. "You fall in?" Outside, thunder split the night. A bolt struck nearby, lighting the whole ruin in a white flash. For a moment Roderik saw her silhouette cast against the stone wall, wings of shadow sprouting from her back, not part of her, but remembered by the space around her. She looked like a martyr carved from ash. And Roderik, the knight of nothing, stared into her broken face and whispered, "You never lost your faith." Mela smiled. "I just learned where to put it." Chapter 16. The Ninth Path. Sleep became an enemy. Ever since Meola spoke her true name, the visions had worsened. Where once Roderik merely dreamed of black flame and warped sigils, now he walked in places not made for men, guided by whispers that spoke in silence and truths that bled. He fought it for days, marching, meditating, gripping the sword until his knuckles cracked, but exhaustion claimed all things. Eventually the body collapses, and when it did, he fell into the ninth path. It was not a dream. It was a room, if it could be called that, vast and infinite, built of twisted bone and mirror glass, a sky of screaming stars overhead, constellations reshaped into runes that crawled across the cosmos. Below, a sea of chained screams rolled like water. And at the center, 5 thrones. 4 were filled. Khorne sat atop a skull-hewn mountain, his veins running with boiling blood, skin stitched with veins of brass, eyes twin suns of rage. Every breath he took killed something. Nurgle, fat with love and disease, drooled maggots onto the bones of the world, swaying gently as if to music only he could hear. Every blink birthed a new blight. Tzeentch shimmered in 1,000 faces, each whispering a different lie. His throne constantly rebuilt itself, reshaping every second, a contradiction in time and geometry. Slaanesh reclined atop silks spun from despair, their body both exquisite and obscene, eyes half-lidded in eternal hunger. Their throne moaned softly beneath them. They argued, not with words, but with concepts. With power, with philosophies that collided like planets. Reality bent as they spoke. But what Roderik saw, what froze his soul, was the 5th throne. Empty, grant. Its frame was scorched, but not by fire, not any flame born of aether or warp. It bled inward, flame that devoured itself, heat that left no smoke. A crown of spiraling ash hovered above it, never settling. And around that throne, the other gods flinched. Not out of fear, out of memory. They had forgotten why they were afraid. But they were. Suddenly the thrones turned. Their faces, not physical but immense avatars of concept, glared down at him. "You are not meant to walk here," Khorne roared, each syllable a battlefield. "You carry rot, not of my garden," whispered Nurgle, vines reaching from his throne, wilting upon touching Roderik. Tzeentch tilted a head that wasn't a head. You wear contradiction. I despise contradiction. Slaanesh caressed their lips and purred. You taste of absence. How tragic. But none dared approach the fifth throne. Roderik stepped toward it, compelled by forces deeper than gravity. The moment his boot touched the first of the 9 spiral steps leading up to it, the throne burned. Not brighter, deeper. Everything became silence. Color. Voice. Flesh. Roderik felt his body coming apart, not torn, unrippen. And he heard the throne speak. Not aloud. I was. I am not. I will be again. You are the crack, the hollow blade, the unnamed. They fear me because I bring the truth they cannot kill, that they are lies wearing faith. Roderik screamed. He woke in a violent fit, flailing, knocking over his cot, vomit and blood pouring from his mouth, ears bleeding. Mela rushed to him, catching his shoulders. He gripped her arms, eyes wide with horror. The throne, he gasped. The fifth throne, it's waiting. She steadied him, trembling herself. What did it say? He looked past her, eyes unfocused. It said, I carry its crack. Then, with a voice not his own, the throne of betrayal shall sit crowned in silence. And all the candles in the room snuffed out. Chapter 17. Ash-bearer. The prophecy had always been spoken in whispers, a tale carved in ash on broken stone. A bearer of ruin walking where gods fall silent, the one who will bear the weight of ruin's ruin, the fire that devours fire. Roderik never believed it. But now the world did. They came upon the battlefield at twilight, an expanse of bone and rust-stained earth where 2 cult armies had obliterated each other, leaving mounds of steaming corpses that still twitched with demonic echo. Warp flies buzzed through the air, fat with filth, and carrion demons rooted in the flesh, pulling tongues from mouths to fashion whips of devotion. The veiled flame stood grim at the ridge. Mela pointed to the center, where something moved, not walked, glided, dragged, unbent reality around it. Roderik saw Uberstrike, but this was no man. He was taller now, twisted into obscene grace, his violet armor fused to his flesh, his jaw elongated into a permanent leer, eyes pupilless and burning with euphoric malice. From his back rose 6 barbed wings of raw nerve and porcelain, and in his hand he carried a blade that looked more like a splintered scream than a weapon. It shrieked, even while at rest, speaking in tongues only demons could understand. The very air recoiled around it. He had ascended. Uberstrike, knight of Slaanesh. Uberstrike, chosen of the mirror flesh. And he remembered. His voice was velvet thunder. Roderik, the ash-bearer, the one who walked away from gods and still found a throne. Roderik stepped forward, blade drawn, helm in hand. His white-necked steel hummed like a dirge. I didn't walk away, he said. I was thrown out. Uberstrike laughed. The air trembled. Trees behind them wilted. Blood ran uphill. You carry it, don't you? He cooed. The fire that hates flame, the god that betrayed gods. They speak of you in the viscera realms. They fear your name. Roderik raised his sword. They clashed beneath the ashen sky. Uberstrike moved like a dream of speed, blades spinning, wings slicing air, shrieking swords screaming in a choir of suffering. His first strike cracked the earth. His second grazed Roderik's shoulder, peeling armor like fruit skin, leaving muscle exposed to the wind. Roderik's blade met Uberstrike's with a detonating screech, sending black sparks through the air like shattered commandments. Every clash of their weapons unraveled light around them, warping color, distorting time. Ulbrich laughed as he fought. "You should thank me, old friend. You're famous in the warp now. You're the one who carries nothing, the one who makes the gods bleed." Roderik roared, blood streaming from his mouth, and drove his sword forward, not to strike Ulbrich's heart, but his weapon. The twin flame blades struck Ulbrich's demon-forged sword and devoured it. Not broke, not shattered, and made. The screaming ceased. The demonic voices in Ulbrich's blade died with a final wail of betrayed hunger. Ulbrich staggered. "You!" Roderik didn't wait. He slashed across Ulbrich's chest, tearing armor, then across his throat. Black-pink ichor sprayed into the sky. Wings flailed in agony. "You bear the enemy of all," Ulbrich shrieked. Then he fell, convulsing, his limbs shrinking, warping, his body cracking in half like a cocoon trying to be reborn. And the flame touched him. He vanished. Not destroyed. Erased. Only ashes remained. Roderik stood alone. The battlefield was silent. Mela approached, staring at him, not as a friend, not even as a leader, but as a figure now beyond recognition. She dropped to one knee. "Ash-bearer." The rest of the veiled flame followed, kneeling in the ruinous dusk. Roderik said nothing, but the flame in his sword pulsed, white and black. And somewhere in the warp's endless spiral, the god stirred. Chapter 18. The Battle of Caer Dranik. Caer Dranik had once been a dwarf-hold of immense repute, a fortress built into the black spines of the Greyfang peaks, known for its mirrored obsidian halls and vaults that reached into the bones of the world. Now it was a corpse wrapped in lies. The sky above it hung heavy with violet smog. The peaks were jagged and crooked, as if the mountains themselves were writhing. The fortress gates, 5 stories tall, carved in runes of protection, lay broken, melted, as if by breath, not flame. Inside, a portal waited, not just to another realm, but to the anti-realms, to where chaos goes to die. And the veiled flame had come to close it or be consumed by it. The approach was a slaughter. Slanky warbands clashed with Tzeentchian horrors locked in orgiastic war, writhing around pools of mutating ichor. Tentacled knights rode steeds made of living skin, their lances dripping with sensation. Flamers danced across the parapets, spewing truths that set stone on fire. The veiled flame charged in silence. Roderik led, his twin-hued blade alight with that hateful fire, white-edged and black, burning not with heat, but with purpose. Behind him, Mela chanted a reversal of the litany of binding, each syllable unmaking the enchantments that twisted the gates shut. As they passed into the inner keep, the mirror portal revealed itself. A perfect disk of obsidian, 15 feet wide, floating just above the cracked throne room dais. It did not reflect what stood before it. Instead, it showed other scenes. Orn's legions drowning in their own blood, unable to stop killing. Nurgle's gardens blooming into black sunflowers that devoured their own seeds. Tzeentch turning into a loop of masks arguing with themselves, dissolving into sand. Slem shrieking in an empty hall of mirrors, starving for reflection. Chaos, cannibalized. Mela whispered, "This is not just a gate. It's a warning." Then the war truly began. A demon prince of Slaanesh descended from the ceiling in a flutter of flayed silk, its voice a living violin, bowing itself across broken harp-strings of flesh. It sang a hymn that made some of the younger acolytes rip out their eyes to stop seeing it. Roderik met it head-on. The demon danced, elegant, divine, faster than thought. It left trails of pink-gold smoke where its claws passed. But Roderik's blade burned with revulsion. When it struck the demon, the creature screeched, not in pain, but in confusion, as if it had been seen for what it truly was. Roderik carved through its chest, not cutting, but deleting. The wound did not bleed. It ceased to exist. The demon wailed, fell backward into the mirror, and imploded. On the other side, its reflection did not mimic the fall. It laughed. Then it tore itself in half. The veiled flame fought with every ounce of will left. Acolytes cast runes of negation. Sigil knives sang as they slashed into demon flesh. One Warperius detonated in a blast of reverse light, taking out an entire flank of Slaaneshi zealots. Bodies piled like broken prayers. But the portal, it pulsed. Every minute it remained open, more reality unraveled. Stone turned to sand. Sky fractured. Some warriors froze in place, their future selves dragging them backwards into death. Malor approached the mirror, scrolls clutched in bleeding hands. She began the unbinding rite. Roderik fought to protect her, cutting down a sorcerer with a single strike that ripped the color from his soul. Another demonic creature leapt from the shadows, half spider, half music, but Roderik's blade refused to even sing for it. It simply ended. Malor's final chant was a scream. Her hands bled from the runes burning into her flesh. Her mask cracked again, this time along her eye. And the mirror broke. Not shattered, not destroyed. It simply closed, folding into itself, leaving behind only a mark in the air, like the afterimage of a scream never heard. The battlefield fell silent. No more daemons came. No more voices spoke. Only the wind returned, and Roderik fell to one knee, not from pain, from the weight of what he'd just offended, from the gate to a place where gods forget how to be gods. Chapter 19. Oaths of Dust. The mirror was supposed to be gone. They had sealed it, spoken the unbinding rites. The veiled flame had bled and burned to close the gateway. But something remained. A rift, thin as a knife's breadth, shimmered in the air like a memory refusing to die. No shape, no light, just absence. A wound in the weave of the world, humming with contradiction. Roderik stared at it with clenched fists, his sword whispering to him in its twin-colored flame. Not a call to battle, a warning. And then he heard the music. Silken, barbed. Uberstrike returned. He descended through the broken dome of Kadronik's upper hall, drifting, wings of nerve and porcelain hanging from his back like the shattered banners of a fallen seraph. His flesh was liquid beauty and screaming indulgence, his smile stretched wide and wrong. The air bent around him. Tynd stumbled. The veiled flame froze in place. Only Roderik moved. Uberstrike landed lightly, his fingers dragging through the blood on the stone floor. "This is the end," he said, almost mournful. "The gods have no more patience for your flame." Roderik said nothing. His sword spoke for him, igniting in a roar of white and black fire. They charged. Uberstrike's blade was gone, destroyed in their last encounter, but he didn't need it now. His fingers split open, revealing tendrils of glass and song, lashing with the weight of a daemon's pride. Each strike carried pain, lust, and power, and each time Roderik blocked them, his sword groaned in resistance. Uberstrike struck with hate, Roderik with grief. They fought through the ruins, slashing, colliding, rending. Masonry cracked, statues of dwarf kings were obliterated. The air wept blood where Uberstrike's aura passed. A shard of music pierced Roderik's shoulder, slicing through bone. He screamed, retaliated with a strike that tore through Uberstrike's wing, ripping the limb from its socket. Uberstrike howled, voice harmonized with 1,000 orgasmic wails, filling the sky with suffering. But it was not enough. The rift began to widen. The mirror may have closed, but the scar remembered. And it was hungry. Mela stepped forward, pale and shaking. The scrolls she had used in the sealing rite were now burnt into her hands, fused into scar tissue. Her mask hung from her neck, and for the first time her eyes were filled with fear. She looked to Roderik. "I can hold it," she said. "No," he breathed. "There must be another way." "There isn't. I saw it. In the scriptures. The bearer survives, but only if the voice is silenced." He shook his head, stepping toward her, but her fingers brushed his cheek, a goodbye carved in warmth and inevitability. "You carry him now," she whispered. "The one who speaks when all others lie. Let me give him silence to speak through." Then she turned and walked into the rift. Her body shimmered as she entered the wound in reality, black fire licking at her edges, curling her like parchment. She chanted in a voice not hers, not mortal, the sound of truths unspoken. Her figure dimmed, shrank, and vanished. The rift sealed, and the mountains screamed. Uberstrike howled, enraged by the loss of the rift, by Mela's sacrifice. "You cling to nothing, you follow a flame that hates fire, you serve the enemy of all." Roderik raised his sword. "I serve no god," he charged. Uberstrike met him with everything, grief, fury, divine ecstasy. Roderik's blade caught him clean through the heart. Not pierced, unwrote. Uberstrike's body did not fall. It folded inward, collapsing on itself like an origami of blood and screaming silk. His flesh unwound, became smoke, then memory, then silhouette. A silhouette of smoke and negation hung in the air. Then, gone. Roderik stood alone among the rubble and ash. His sword burned low. Quiet now. No scream. No whisper. Just silence. And Mila's voice echoing across the broken stones. "You carry him now." Chapter 20. The God Without Chains. Cardranik was silent. The stone beneath Roderik's feet no longer groaned with weight. The air had turned still, thick with the scent of ash and old iron. The last of the veiled flame lay behind him, some broken, some gone, some kneeling in prayer they could no longer remember the words for. Only the mirror remained. Or rather, what came after it. Though shattered, its imprint lingered. An arch of lightless smoke, flickering not with flame, but with the memory of fire. A door etched into the air, defined only by contradiction. Where light should shine, it consumed. Where reflection should reveal, it denied. Roderik stood before it, Mela's final words echoing in the hollow space behind his ribs. "You carry him now." He didn't speak. He stepped through. There was no threshold, no moment of crossing, just nothing, and then awareness. He stood in a world without color, not darkness, not void, a place that had chosen to be neither. Beneath his feet, a floor of cracked obsidian and bleached bone, swirling together in patterns that refused to settle. Above him, a sky of perfect stillness, not gray, but absence, with stars that blinked in and out of being like thoughts forgotten mid-prayer. No gods here. No winds of magic. No weight of prophecy or fate. Just balance through distraction. Roderik walked. Not far. Distance didn't exist here. Only intention. He approached the throne. Not carved, not forged. It was present, like gravity or guilt. Wrought from spirals of glass and flame that turned inward, it sat alone in this temple of negation, crackling not with power, but with defiance. Not of love, not of chaos, but of everything that dared to define. And it was empty, but not abandoned. At its base was a mirror, not to himself, but to what he had become. Roderik saw versions of himself in that glass, flickering, Roderik the Templar, blade clean, eyes blind with duty. Roderik the Demon crowned in ruin, wings of betrayal unfurled. Roderik dead, a martyr, buried beneath banners that lied about what he believed. Roderik lost, forgotten, buried by the silence he once embraced. And then, nothing, a version of himself that had no face, no weapon, no allegiance, just ash drifting in the shape of a man. And it spoke, not with voice but with recognition. "I see you now," Roderik whispered. He stepped forward, touching the mirror. It didn't reflect. It opened. A whisper poured out not in words but in concepts so ancient that language cracked trying to form them. He felt it burn through him, not pain but clarity. Every oath broken, every god silenced, every truth betrayed into freedom. And he understood. The gods feared him not because he was enemy, but because he was proof. Proof that chaos could not last. That order was a lie, that nothing is sacred, not flame, not fade, not faith. Roderik fell to one knee before the throne. He did not bow. He did not pray. He only spoke. "I see you now, you who all others fear to name. The god without chains, the ruin of ruin, the hollow flame, the one erased so no one would ask why." A breath passed through the realm. Not wind, not life, a name, spoken for the first time in 1,000,000 years. Maleo,